It's an action-packed edition of World DNA. We're starting with all the updates from Israel. After months of protests, Israel has passed a highly controversial bill into law. Shivan has all the details for you.
Thanks, Im. I'll take it from here. Of course, it's months raging right back to February when all the protests started. It's nearly 6 months of massive protests across Israel, which involved businesses, unions, defense forces, and even members of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's own government. The Knesset, in spite of all the protests, has passed the controversial Reasonableness bill, the first major part of the proposed judicial overhaul. Now, on World DNA, we're going to break down for you what the Reasonableness bill is and what we can expect to see in Israel after this controversial portion of the judicial overhaul was passed. Now, the Reasonableness bill strips the Israeli Supreme Court of the power to declare government decisions unreasonable. This means that the Supreme Court in Israel can no longer overturn laws passed by the Knesset. Judges can no longer determine the constitutionality or lawfulness of a given legislation. And this is the first major part of Prime Minister Netanyahu's judicial overhaul plan. Netanyahu's supporters say it is meant to rebalance powers between the branches of government and establish a system of checks and balances between the legislative, executive, and the judiciary. Now, those who are criticizing and protesting against the proposed changes say it poses a threat to Israeli democracy and to the independence of the judiciary. However, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his supporters argue from their side, saying that the top court has become an insular and elitist group and it doesn't represent the people. Now, they say it has overstepped its role, getting into issues it should not rule on. Now, there's more to it. It doesn't end here. This is just the first part. If the proposed overall passes, these changes would cause the biggest shake-up to Israel's judiciary since its founding in 1948. Supporters of the reform say that the overpowered Supreme Court is problematic. Critics say if the proposed bills are passed, the government would have more control over what goes on in the judiciary and the top court, including the appointment of judges. Now, back in February, we're talking about earlier this year, just a month after the bills were proposed, the Israeli Democracy Institute performed a poll. And this is what they found. We're giving you those figures. 72% of Israeli citizens wanted the government and the protesters to come to a compromise. 66% of the polled people were of the opinion that the Supreme Court should have the power to strike down laws which it deemed were against the people. Another 63% of Israeli citizens opined that the current method of appointing judges should remain as it is. Now, from these figures, it seems that while the far-right government wants the overall, the citizens are not keen on the legislature intervening in judicial matters. So Israel's internal divide is expected to get even deeper after this bill was passed on Monday. Those who oppose it have warned of labor strikes, shutdowns, and have even refused to serve in the military. The country's umbrella labor union have made preparations to declare a strike. Tensions are going to continue in Israel. This is just the beginning, and that is what it seems like. Petitions are being filed in the Supreme Court asking it to find the Reasonableness law illegal on the grounds that it changes the basic structure of Israeli democracy. Petitioners are also requesting that the top court block implementation of the law until the court has ruled on it. Now, the Israeli Bar Association is already preparing a legal challenge. The Bar Council is also petitioning the Supreme Court to cancel the Reasonableness law. The Bar also warned that it will shut down as an act of protest against the anti-democratic legislative process. Opposition to the overhaul has also reached Israel's defense forces. More than 10,000 Israeli defense forces, these are reservists, will suspend their volunteer reserve duty. Now, these are major figures which have come in, which can possibly change the national security. It can possibly hamper the national security of Israel. Now, if the Supreme Court rules the Reasonableness law itself as unreasonable, it could trigger a constitutional crisis that sets the government and the court against each other, which is not good news for any nation. Now, for more details on this reform and what has happened in Israel, we have Colonel Rich Outzen joining us live from Washington, D.C. He is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, the Jamestown Foundation, and a renowned Middle East expert. Welcome to the broadcast, sir.
Good to be here with you.
Now, after all the protests and unrest, the Israeli government has still pushed through. I wouldn't say it was expected. People still thought that after so many months of protests, probably there would be they would take longer, or perhaps they would reconsider their decision, but they've gone ahead with it. They've taken the first step for the judicial overhauls. Let's just start with how, what does it mean for Israel going forward, and how will it affect the way the country functions and the divide which has now obviously been widened between the government and what the people are asking for?
Yeah, well, it's a good point. It's a very deeply divided country on this issue. I have friends. I've worked 4 years in Israel between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, and have friends across the political spectrum, both the conservatives and on the more liberal side. And it's a deeply divided electorate on this issue. And part of the reason is there is not in Israel a constitution like the United States has. It's a country that was put together with some basic laws, but without a fundamental constitution. So when you have a separation of powers between the judiciary and the legislative and the executive, in the United States, the key power that is vested in the judiciary is to interpret the Constitution. So in Israel, this, of course, is problematic without there being an actual formal constitution. So they have this doctrine that evolved over the course of the last 50, 60 years of reasonableness. And if a law is passed by the legislature or implemented by the executive that is deemed to be not within the bounds of the reasonable by the unelected judiciary, then it can be overturned. So there's a softness, there's a sort of a flexibility there that's difficult to argue from a democratic perspective that's entirely sort of the way that the game is played. So the conservative movement in Israel has glommed onto this because typically what's happened is more conservative governments have passed decisions that more liberal jurists have found to be unacceptable. And I think that the conservative movement is finding this less and less acceptable. Now, the reason that this is coming to a head now, because it's been an issue, frankly, for 15 or 20 years, is because this current Israeli government has a larger sort of far-right element to it between the political religious elements and the settlers, so that there is real fear that they're going to change some of the basic mores of Israeli society. So it's led to unprecedented discontent in Israel.
Right, so absolutely. In fact, just to understand this better, of course, as we know, it's just the first bill. It's part of a larger judicial overhaul plan. What's your assessment of the other elements of this overhaul, which would give the government more control over the appointment of judges as well?
Well, that's another contrast with the U.S. system, frankly. In the U.S., at the end of the day, for instance, at our high court, the President of the United States has an ability to pick new justices for the Supreme Court. So if a Supreme Court justice is going to, this is a major point of U.S. politics, in fact. So President Trump, for instance, was able to appoint in a single term, a 4-year term, 3 Supreme Court justices, which really put a conservative imprint on the conservative or on the Supreme Court, which we've seen in some conservative rulings over the last 2 or 3 years. So there's real political weight to that executive control over judicial nominees. But in Israel, that's not the case. In Israel, at the Supreme Court level, essentially you have judges picking judges. So this, of course, raises the issue of self-dealing. And is there really a democratic aspect to a group of highly educated elites picking their own replacements when they're going to be making decisions about the implementation of law in the country? So I think that this is a unique instance. In the case of Israel, very few countries have this set up. As an American and as a friend of Israel, I'm watching very carefully because, frankly, both of these elements, the fact that there is no constitution for the judiciary to base its role on, right, as opposed to the reasonableness law, and the fact that they are self-selecting, are reasonable arguments. So it's at the same time, it's clearly a case where Netanyahu can be doing this from a extremely self-motivated and politically selfish motive, and not necessarily in the best interest of the country. So there's reasons for concern, and there are good arguments on both sides.
Colonel Outzen, now, of course, you understand the defense mechanism of your country very well. Just to take your opinion on this, 10,000 reservists have announced that they will not continue volunteering if overall legislation passes, and now, of course, it is being passed. Now, what impact will this have on Israel's national security?
Well, Israel has an excellent military. The IDF is among the world's best qualitatively and in terms of the equipment they have. But I will say this is the one thing that really surprised me. Knowing a little bit about the Israeli left and the right, I'm not surprised about the arguments, and I'm not surprised about the vehemence on both sides in those arguments. But it seems to me rational. If you see that sort of the backbone of Israeli security, so these the fighter pilots, the intelligence units from Israeli Defense Intelligence and Unit 8200 and so forth, thousands, not just of your average conscripts, but of some of the most elite intelligence and fighter pilot and other military reservists in Israel. And keep in mind that Israel's military, its active duty force is fairly small. Its strength is in its reserves and the ability to rapidly mobilize large numbers of highly skilled reservists in a highly educated country. The fact that they were signaling, hey, this is critical, punt this. So wait 6 months, 12 months, 18 months. To me, and the fact that there were sounds coming out of Jerusalem in the last week or so that there's a sort of a compromise in the works, and that they might delay this and try to find a sort of a more gradual path to addressing the concerns of the conservatives, that seemed like the right way forward. So now that they've pushed to the point where the reservists actually are fearing for the quality of the government, the democratic quality of the government that they are called upon to defend, this is kind of unprecedented in the history of the state of Israel. So I was surprised by that. I thought it was a little bit rushed. I thought there was an opportunity for compromise, and that the government, had it played its game and played its hand patiently, could have still gotten what it wanted. I will say, knowing the Israeli Defense Forces very well, look, they're still capable. They'll be capable of defending the country, but this is still a major destabilizing factor and fairly unprecedented in the history of the state.
Right. Well, Colonel Outzen, thank you so much for joining us on the show this morning with your insights on this.
Good to be with you. Thank you.